Hello there. I'd like to welcome you to the Virtual Training Company presentation of C++. My name is Mark Long and I'll be your instructor for this course. And the purpose of the course is to introduce you to the C++ language. Now C++ has a reputation out there of being a bit challenging, a bit confusing, and it is all of those things, all right? But C++ is really quite simple if you just kind of go step by step, layer upon layer. And the main thing that you need to understand about C++ is the basic syntax, the basic functionalities, and really just a place to get started, and that's exactly what I'm going to go through with you in this course. C++ has as its main claim to fame the language of the Windows operating system. So most people who want to become proficient Windows programmers take up C++, all right? So I'm glad you're here. You've got a lot to learn in this course. We're going to cover lots of stuff, so let's get started. Now before we jump into the course, I'd like to give you a little overview of the topics we're going to talk about, kind of where we're headed, and just kind of provide you a roadmap of what you can expect as we work through C++ here. We're going to start off with a little C++ history. It always helps to understand how the technology you're working with kind of developed and evolved and got to where you are. It can really help you understand some of the concepts that you see a little bit later on, because usually most of us in the development world have a history with other programming languages, and when you can find these little correlations to other languages, it can really flatten your learning curve. Then from there, after history, we're going to talk about C++ standards, what they are, what they mean, how they're going to affect you. Then we're going to talk specifically about Visual C++ 2010 Express. This is the free version for developing C++. It's an integrated development environment. It's from Microsoft. We will use this one throughout the class. I didn't choose it because it's necessarily the best. Trying to choose the best development environments like trying to choose the best music. Everybody has a different opinion for different reasons, but this one is an excellent one by anybody's measurements. It is free. It's very easy to get. It's from Microsoft. It installs usually without any hassles, and so it gets us all on the same page quickly. Then we're going to jump into the C++ essentials. We're going to talk about C++, C++ and the CLI, or the Common Language Runtime, all that kind of stuff in the Microsoft world and the differences between the two. Then we'll talk a little bit about program structures in C++, Windows C++, all those little issues that are out there, the little nuances that trip people up. Then we'll jump into program structure, and we will talk about how your C++ programs are organized, how they run, what you need to know when you begin programming these things. Then we'll jump into the basics. We're going to talk about variables, our data types, constants, increment and decrement operators, calculation sequences, duration, scope, and all those things. And then from there we'll jump into pointers, or what's also called indirect data access. Pointers are a big part of C++. They just absolutely confuse us to no end if we've never worked with them before, and so we'll go through pointers and do some examples there. Then of course, along with pointers, references. Then we'll take a look at control structures. Control structures, we're talking about things like if statements, then statements, loops, the do-while loop and the for loop and all that sort of thing. And that's really part and parcel of what programming is about. You're trying to manipulate things in memory based on conditions. From there we'll jump into functions, another major portion of any C++ program. We'll talk about function prototypes, arguments, overloading, pointers as arguments, all those sorts of things. I'll touch on exceptions just a little bit. Exceptions can get really deep really quickly, but I want to give you a foundation to start with on exceptions. From there we'll talk about arrays, some of the basics of arrays, and we'll use that as a springboard for jumping on to containers later. Then I'll talk about object-oriented programming. This is a must understand to be efficient in almost any language nowadays, but especially C++. And we'll talk about understanding classes, how to define a class, creating objects from classes, or instantiating objects. Then we'll talk about constructors and destructors and unions and structs and so forth. From there we'll touch on inheritance, just enough to help you really understand what inheritance is. A lot of examples through all this stuff, very simple examples that will help you get your head wrapped around what's going on here. Then we'll talk about virtual functions. Sounds very funky, but it's pretty straightforward, really cool stuff. And then we'll jump on containers, and we'll concentrate on the vector container. There's a bunch of different containers, but we're going to concentrate on the vector to let you see. And these are really arrays with a lot more bells and whistles and pre-programmed functionality. So anyway, then we'll close it out and talk about how to get to the next level and so forth. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff, and so let's just jump into it and get busy. One question that comes to mind probably pretty quickly for you is, well, what's the big deal? Why C++? What should motivate me to spend a considerable amount of effort really learning what C++ is and how to use it? Well, there's a number of reasons, and let's start with design. To start off with, C++ was designed to be a general purpose programming languages. Now, most languages that you see out there were created to solve very specific tasks. And that's the way most developers are, or people that architect these languages. We tend to look for certain size hammers for certain size nails. And as a result, the products that we create, and I'm saying we as if I'm a software designer and I'm anything but a software designer tends to build software or a programming language to do a specific task that they need done. For example, you'll use the Transact SQL language to build relational database queries. You'll use something like Visual Basic or C# for creating event-driven Windows applications. You might use Java for network programming. Well, as it turns out, ironically, C++ is often the best choice for you when you really can't find the ideal language that you need to use because of the scope of your project. Now let's talk about functionality. C++ is often used kind of like programming glue, if you will. You've got solutions for large and complex tasks, and they require multiple languages. The T-SQLs, the Javas, the different flavors of C, other things. And as a result, what you need is something to kind of stick all these languages together, to kind of manage everybody, to hook into all of them and pull them in together and make them behave as a team. C++ was designed to do just that. Now, standardization is another one. Let's go back to our history video. If you haven't watched that one, go watch the movie on the history of C++. C++ has been around a long time. It is really got a lot of ancestry back to the very early days of computing, and so there's a lot of standardization just built into C++ because of its history. And since it's been around so long, and since so many nerds, if you'll allow me to use that term, have used C++, they designed their languages to be easily connectable or easily managed by C++. So the languages kind of come bent towards C++, if you will. And then there's performance. Now, C++ was carefully designed with performance in mind. Good example of that. If you look over in the .NET framework, and we'll talk about this some as we get into some of the examples, in the .NET framework, one of the big selling points is the garbage collector. It'll take care of destroying objects for you. It'll take care of freeing up memory. In C++, in the real native C++, you don't have garbage collection. Why? Because it introduces a fair amount of overhead into your environment, and C++ is designed to have a small footprint, to run very quickly, very efficiently, and so that's just one of the little things you're going to see here. So performance is a big deal. So when you take all these things and add them together, you can see very clearly why you would want to use C++. Because when you're working with a project that needs to tie together or involve a bunch of other different programming languages, if you're trying to just wring out every bit of performance you can, if you need something that you know is going to work with everyone, it's been around a while, everybody knows how it works and functions, C++ is where you need to be, and that's why C++ is here.